Hello everyone, my name is Matthew, and on behalf of the organisers Oliver Kinross, I'd like to welcome you all to the latest Festival of BIM and Digital Construction webinar. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of our sponsors, with special mention of MBS, our sponsor for today's session. Today's webinar will feature a panel discussion on the construction trends driving digital change. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so take the opportunity to submit your questions in the questions box on your screen. I'd now like to pass over to Richard Waterhouse, the moderator for today's session.
Thank you, Matthew, and welcome everybody to this session. I'm Richard Waterhouse. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at MBS, and I'd like to say welcome to you all. We have a fantastic panel to talk about the construction trends that are driving digital change. In a minute, I'll introduce all of those panel members and ask them just to talk a little bit about themselves and their roles. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the current trading environment and the effects that COVID have had on digital and the progress towards a digital construction industry. We'll talk a little bit about transformation and how transformation is taking place right now and the drivers of transformation. We're not going to forget sustainability and the climate emergency that still is happening to all of us. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Building Safety Bill, a piece of legislation particularly for the UK that is likely to drive that digitisation, and also a little bit about the BIM leadership, the position that the UK has had and where it goes next in terms of coordinating activity. So let's start by introducing the panel. I'm going to start with Dale. Dale, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, good morning, Richard. Good morning, everyone. My name's Dale Sinclair. I'm a director at AECOM. Most of what I do is really deliver innovation into live projects. So we're really at the kind of cutting edge of kind of delivering innovation into reality, if you like. So I'm a big believer in free horizon thinking, and of course, because we're using tools on live projects, they really need to be robust and relevant to what we're doing today. So that's the most of what I do. And for me, I think we are probably 3 to 5 years from a paradigm shift. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today and talking around the drivers for change, Richard.
Thanks for that, Dale. Thank you. And I know we've got lots of interesting things we'll be talking about. Also on the design side, I'm delighted to say that we have Jaimie Johnson, and Jaimie is an absolute specialist in looking at new ways of constructing, particularly around platforms. Jaimie, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi all. Morning, Richard. Yeah, Jaimie Johnson. I'm head of global systems at the Bryden. So for those who haven't come across us, we're an integrated design consultancy. We were set up 25 years ago specifically to look at what a more manufacturer-led sector would look like. So we've developed lots of different design for manufacturing assembly systems for various clients in different sectors. The platforms initiative that Richard mentioned is our attempt to distill everything we've learnt over 25 years into a reasonably common kit of parts. So we're trying to find the kind of common kit of parts that you could deliver, schools, hospital, apartment buildings, offices, etc., etc. So we've been developing that with the public sector. You might have seen it's the focus of the Construction Innovation Hub, of which I'm also the design lead. So we're trying to take all of our knowledge, bake it into a IKEA kit of parts for construction, and then use that to massively scale up adoption of DFMA. And obviously, it's got a huge digital component, which we'll talk about later.
Thank you for that, Jaimie. I'm also absolutely delighted to introduce May Winfield as well. May comes from this from a legal point of view and has been quite instrumental in some of the legal perspectives as we move towards this integrated collaborative digital environment. May, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Richard. Morning. I, as you mentioned, am a lawyer for my sins, and I am an associate director at international engineering firm BuroHappold. People may have heard of it from various big projects like Museum of the Future, the big waterfall in Singapore Changi Airport, and I have co-authored and authored various documentation and studies about BIM, digital, and I continue to look at it from the legal side, because there's no point implementing digital change whilst ignoring the contract and ignoring your documentation and how it impacts your legal risk, which I think we're all guilty of doing when BIM first came about, and leading to potential disputes and just disappointment all round.
Thank you for that, mate. Really looking forward to getting into some of those areas, particularly around the guidance work as well. But before we get to that, last but not least is my colleague, Stephen Hamil. Stephen is our Director of Innovation. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Richard. Yeah, hi, everybody. I've worked on all of the MBS products for the last 20 years or so, and in particular, MBS Chorus, our latest specification product platform in the cloud, and also MBS Source, where the leading construction manufacturers can list their technical information also in the cloud.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Before we get into the discussions, and we're going to start with trading COVID and change due to COVID, just a reminder to all the people listening and viewing the webinar, do send your questions through. We'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. So if you things you would like to ask the team about how they've approached starting with COVID, please put them through on the chat box now. So I'm going to start with the panel and about trading, and in particular, how COVID has changed the construction industry. We can see in many industries, COVID has accelerated some of the change that was already taking place. The change in retail and the shift to digital in retail is very evident. Is that the same in construction? Are we seeing the push that we've all believed in actually starting to take place now? Dale, what's your experience of that?
I think, well, our experience, I mean, when we went into COVID, I mean, most of my team were, well, most of the AECOM team actually were already on laptops. We were already cloud-based, so it was a fairly clean transition from us being in the office to home. I guess most of the challenges for us is, you know, driving kind of major kind of projects through the process is that lack of ability to be sitting across the table from people and sketching and so on, and those kind of workshop environments. I think that's where the biggest challenge has certainly been. But we had a session with one of our software providers using Mural, and I was actually blown away with how effective it was. So I think we are kind of teasing out how new tools can make us work in different ways. So it's been fairly good for us. I think the one point I would make is, for me, my concern was that those that were kind of, if you like, the leading edge of digital were really starting to pull away from, let's say, those that were, I mean, in innovation curve terms, the kind of late majority were starting to pull away. And I guess I was starting to get concerned that if the gap gets bigger, the challenges get harder and harder, because you're trying to sell more and more innovation, and the clients have got this plethora and bigger range of those that kind of are still working in 2D and those that are really at the leading edge of D4MA and digital ways of working. So I think what's been good about this is it's forced people to get onto some of the tools, and if the analogy is a ladder, I think the rungs of the ladder have kind of decreased. So I think that gap's narrowed, which I think has been great.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting issue, isn't it? As we try and change an industry, are we trying to take a few people forward very quickly, or are we trying to bring everybody along in small steps to make that major change? Jaimie, you've got an interesting change initiative going on, but let's start with COVID and how that's changed the way that your organisation works. Has this been good?
Yeah, I'd echo what Dale says, actually. I mean, it's lucky timing that the pandemic happened when it did. If this had been 2 years ago, I think we really would have struggled. But as Dale says, we had teams in the office, we all had laptops. The speed with which we could relocate people and everyone could actually be incredibly productive. And it's been interesting seeing how people have used teams. Little sort of impromptu teams have popped up all over the place. There's a sort of ecosystem of teams in the office. So yeah, it's certainly yeah, it's been incredible how quickly we could adapt to this. And you know, globally, I read a thing that Chief Exec of Barclays saying we're running Barclays off kitchen tables and laptops. Everyone's sort of finding that. I think the difference with the construction is the very physical bit, so where you actually have to have people working on site. So what we've started to see is obviously a lot of the stuff we were doing with platforms and looking at automation we were doing for productivity gains, but actually I think it lends itself very well to, you know, if the future is fewer people on site, working more productively, working at distance, a load of the things we were already doing for different purposes, I think, are a massive head start. And I heard a thing recently, someone was saying, which doesn't surprise me, that because of COVID, people are obviously using fewer people on site and therefore making their activity much more targeted and therefore thinking much more accurately about numbers of materials and things, and actually productivity for the people who are on site has gone up. And I think that's really interesting, that through nothing other than putting a bit more mental effort in, we've increased productivity, which, because I've always felt true that you could build things quite traditionally but much more productively if you bothered to plan everything out. So we're already starting to see, I think, you know, it's anecdotal evidence, but this idea that people are starting to find ways through this of utilising labour much more intensely and therefore increasing productivity, all of which is a benefit. If we can keep that learning moving forward and say, well, let's not revert, yeah, there's going to be some very positive things come out of this, I suspect.
Yeah, and May, on the kind of engineering side, is that the kind of position you would see as well?
Yeah, it's very similar. I think one of the challenges, as Dale and Jaimie said, in terms of designing, whilst people have gone used to doing Teams calls and which was something probably relatively unheard of, doing design virtually is harder. And I don't know if, as the younger generation who are more used to doing everything online, maybe that will be different. I think one thing I've noticed as well across the industry is that people are more willing to invest in technology and be more and clients more targeted in what they're asking for, because they realize that you do have to have fewer people on site, or you do have to have a greater use of the technology, the digital side. So there's more discussion, more willing to put money towards it. From the contract side, I think people are suddenly realizing clauses like force majeure, which was probably never looked at particularly at all. Most force majeure clauses don't use the word pandemic, just because how many times have we ever seen a pandemic happen? And there are practical discussions about that. What do we do if we just can't get to site, or we can't fly? Particularly most engineering firms, architectural firms do a lot of international projects, and it's again, you look at the technology, you get someone to walk around site for you and record it, and being quite innovative in how you resolve the challenges.
And that's really interesting, because different challenges force innovation. I think we'll probably come on to that when we talk about transformation. So I think that's a really interesting insight, actually. Steve and NBS also face the same challenges. How did we cope with all of this?
Well, I guess there's two aspects to what we do. I guess there's the developing the products aspect, and then there's the supporting customers. And when it comes to developing the products, we already had home workers as technical authors. Our software development is developed across a number of sites, so we were familiar around using things like Visual Studio, Microsoft Teams in particular. In terms of supporting customers, there's been almost no sort of visits to offices, but again, Microsoft Teams has been a bit of a lifesaver. And also just in terms of keeping that community there, if I just share a little slide here, we've been doing sort of regular events. So like regular events all the way from the start of lockdown. The first one was actually kicked off with Dale Sinclair, who's on the call today, his support, and then we've tried to do one event every sort of 1 or 2 weeks. So over 1,000 attending on the plan of work, on fire safety, the big topics, sustainable outcomes. We had Gary Clark from HOK, and then doing things like major product launches, which would previously be at a sort of like big venue in London or Manchester or Edinburgh, doing those online, launching NBS Source, launching our small works package. And of course, our annual conference won't be face-to-face with people shaking hands and eating shortbread and drinking cups of tea. But our annual conference this year will be an online conference. So it's going to be a shame not to see our customers face-to-face, but it does mean we get great speakers, because the speakers don't have to travel. So we've got Dame Judith Hackett again, and a set of like really 5 or 6 top speakers.
Yeah, I think that's a 2-day conference on the 13th and 14th, and the speaker list there, we've just finalised all the speakers over those 2 days. It's a stunning list, so do watch out for the speakers that we're confirming, and we'll be pushing out the names shortly. But as we say, Judith Hackett, Dame Judith Hackett, and that's going to be really critical to a subject we're going to talk about today, which is a building safety bill. But let's go back to that plan of work, that first one, and Dale. So we're going to start talking about transformation. And once again, to all those people watching and listening, don't forget to send those questions through. Transformation requires planning, and planning, if you don't do it, if you fail to plan, you've got to plan to fail. McKinsey have already shown that construction is the least digitized of all of the sectors, behind agriculture and forestry. We have to do better, and there are ways of doing that. There are tools out there now that will help our industry transform. And we've got this big driver in COVID that's making that transformation, but we have other drivers as well, such as sustainability and safety. Starting to plan means the whole process, and I think that comes back to the plan of work. And there's been a huge amount of work done here around the plan of work to give organizations the tools they need. Dale, in terms of the plan of work, it's been adapted quite extensively from the 2013 version. What are the areas that people ought to know about and ought to be using?
I think for me, the kind of, I don't think there's a radical change in the 2020 version. I think for me, the key changes were really acknowledging that the boundaries between stage 2 and 3 are not really solid, because in a sense that is there's a fairly grey area between what is stage 2 and stage 3, and I think that's an eye of the beholder, and different clients have got different views on that. So I think that was the first takeaway for me. I think the second one is around us really being a bit firmer around some of the stage 4 process and what's prescriptive and descriptive. I think there is a lot of confusion around that out there, even in relation to procurement, about who's designing what. I do see a lot of people confused, and I'm sure May would back this up, that some people think that, you know, the contractor is doing all the design and build, whereas in reality you still have the same designers and the same specialist subcontractors. So I think trying to untangle some of that was core to the plan of work and certainly some of the challenges I have on a day-to-day basis. So and I think, you know, as architects, I don't think we've had enough of a conversation around who adds value to the process in terms of design. Who should be designing the dry lining? Is it a design team, or is it a special subcontractor? I think some elements like the facade are kind of taken as a given that we'll be doing these offsite. But I think the biggest challenge into the future for me is that the products that we need to really drive off-site, if we set aside modular for a second, just don't exist. I mean, we cannot go out and specify a sub-assembly. I can go out and I can buy the products that I could buy. I'm sure someone in 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago going down to the building merchant to buy some clay tiles and bricks and so on. I mean, it's no different fundamentally today. It's the same products, taps. I mean, the Industrial Revolution may have brought a whole plethora of new products like taps and lifts and so on, so more systems into the process. But fundamentally, the products that we can get hold of are just way too small. So I think for me, that is the biggest challenge. And if I was to look at a perfect process, I know some are looking at like twin tracking stage 4 and stage 2, and I think there are a lot of conversations about how the plan of work works within a kind of D4MA context. So good to get Jaimie's view on that. But I think for me, the main thing is how do we remove that friction? So if I start off on a project, say with a sketch, and I end up with what, let's call it the optimum set of information to manufacture and construct a building, how do I take the friction points? And for me, that handover between the design team and the contractor is without a doubt the biggest friction point. So I think the biggest barrier to change right now is procurement.
Jaimie, is that something you concur with?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think a lot of the challenges we're facing at the moment, particularly around sort of design for manufacturing, assembly and platforms, it's not the technical thing. No one doubts that it's technically possible to build a building in this way. A lot of it is the how do you procure it, how do you get your hands on the value. It changes the risk profile potentially. So no one's saying normal construction isn't risky, but at least it's a risk we all understand and can get our heads around. Whereas if you start to shift the risk profile, that causes all sorts of interesting conversations. There's something else around the plan of work that I think is quite interesting, is that, so we like the term DFMA because it's design for manufacturing assembly. So it's not a thing you kind of retrofit at the end of a traditional design process. So if you're designing for manufacturing assembly, you start thinking about the form of construction much earlier. It does tend to left shift activities, so you're trying to put a lot more effort into the front end. And I can imagine a world, you might have seen some of the automated workflows we've got where we're using standard components that we'd have to design, we can sort of bring them into a model very, very quickly. So while we're doing stage 2, I might also have some fabrication details and bill of material stuff in there. And so it's starting to, I like Dale's term, it's starting, the barriers between stage 2 and 3 they're more porous than they used to be. And I think that's going to start to happen more and more as we start to think of buildings potentially as configurations of components rather than things that have gone through a sort of linear bespoke design process. So I think there's going to be some interesting conversations about what the REBA stages mean if we properly got into a sort of fully automated platforms form of construction. There's another iteration of the plan of work coming, I suspect.
Well, a couple of things there. If you want to know more about the plan of work, as Stephen's already mentioned, Dale has already done a webinar. You'll be able to find that on the MBS website, all about the plan of work and where that was being driven. And in our upcoming event, I think it's going to be on the 14th, this particular presentation, we have Wilmot Dixon looking at the constructors side of DFMA. So more to see and hear about that a little bit later. Carrying on the theme of planning, there's been a lot of work done through UK BIM Alliance in providing guidance, and in particular the BIM protocol that you were heavily involved in. Do you want to just tell everybody a little bit about that?
So in 2019, the International BIM standards, the ISO 19650, were released, and those were based on the PAS 1192 series, but it's not like for like. They are different to cater for the fact they work internationally, and that meant that the CIC BIM protocol was outdated because it wasn't ISO compliant. And I led a team of 2 other people, Andrew Croft and Simon Lewis, to prepare over the course of a year a information protocol that works with the ISO 19650 Part 2. So that's the design construction side. The idea is that you take this document, you add it to your contract, regardless what tier you are, whether you are the contractor, the architect, the engineer, and it makes sure everyone is ISO compliant. One big change in it is that we're very conscious of people putting together the contracts. The lawyers don't really understand BIM or the terminology, probably have never heard necessarily of ISO 19650 until their clients mention it. So we've tried to make it as simple as possible, and there's a lot less to fill in. There is and I'd recommend everyone having a look at it, on the UK BIM framework website, there's 2 sets of guidance, one being a concepts guidance, very simple paragraphs about each chapter for the ISO, and that's a good one to get your senior management, your lawyers to read. But then there's a much more detailed guidance and much more technical, how you complete your MPDT, how you what you should do with your BEP, and so on. And that's all been drafted again over the course of a year or more by lots and lots of specialists and experts in the field. So and it's all free as well, as is the protocol.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we keep giving signposts to places where anybody can find out more about this and learn in detail. So the guidance around this with the UK BIM Alliance and the BIM framework is fantastic. Just today, our friends at Autodesk and CIOB have pushed out an infographic looking at the steps towards that digital journey, and Dave Filt being instrumental in some of that as well. So there are lots of places that people can go. But if I'm playing devil's advocate, why should we apply BIM standards? Why is that important, Dale, in terms of delivering projects to a standard? Can't we just do it our own digital way?
I think the trouble is when BIM first started, and probably until recently, your typical contract said something along the lines of do some BIM or achieve BIM. I have seen over the last 2 years ones like, I still see it, or please achieve level 5 BIM. It's all fill in a made up sort of sentence there. And what you think that means and what your client thinks it means will be entirely different. And unless you have a huge EIR set of specifications that cater for every possible circumstance, chances are something will happen and you haven't talked about it, and you're going to end up paying lawyers a lot of money, spending a lot of time trying to discuss the gap in the agreement. When I've seen a bet with someone I know in France, and it was 50 pages as an EIR, combination of EIR and BEP, because they don't have a separate document. And it was 50 pages, and then it had a link to another 100 pages of the employer's requirements, because they weren't following any particular standards, and they were trying to deal with anything that possibly could go wrong. You also, the benefit of standards as well, they've been stress tested to an extent. Because they've been put together over the course of some time, you know that they have talked to various people. They've worked out to some extent what is going to work in most situations. So everyone's on the same page. Same thing of why use standard form contracts. Why not just use a bespoke contract every time? Is because you have the background knowledge. One thing that eventually will happen as well, we will get case law behind the standards, which we don't have yet because it's so new. And that then will feed into how the words in the standards get interpreted. So you don't end up, again, going to your lawyers. You can just sit around a table and sort it out in a sensible way.
Thank you for that. And just once again, for all the people viewing, don't forget, please do send the questions through. If you want to quiz any of the panel members about any of these topics, now's your opportunity to do so. Jaimie, there's another area of transformation. We've mentioned it a few times, but just tell us a little bit more about the work in terms of offsite, of modular, of assembly, of platforms, and why you think that's so fundamental to the transformation of construction.
So platforms, as I say, it's our attempt to sort of bring together everything we've learned. One thing we had noticed when we were developing different systems is the industry tends to focus on the difference between sectors. So people tend to sort of focus on the sector and say, oh, you can't understand how complex the world of housing is and how difficult it is in education. We were noticing things like, simple examples. So floor to floor heights were sort of person heights plus a zone plus the kind of structural zone. And at that depth, at that height, you can get 8 meters, natural height, about 8 meters into a building. So loads of buildings have an 8 meter span and a corridor and an 8 meter span. So schools do, apartments do, healthcare wards do. That's nothing to do with sector. That's just to do with people. So platforms was our attempt to say, well, if you focus not on the differences between sectors, but the commonality, and started to identify common kits of parts that could be used to deliver multiple asset types, suddenly you get into a level of repeatability which gets you into the sorts of numbers manufacturing likes, and suddenly you get into the economies of scale and all of the kind of quality assurance and tracking and all of all the benefits manufacturing's got. You can't land until you've got enough standardization or componentization to allow you to do that. So it was a conversation that started with the government a number of years ago, and obviously they've lent into this now and said, actually, yeah, if I could deliver vast swathes of the public sector social infrastructure using a relatively small kit of parts, the market for those components is massive, and so it drives, as I say, well, that manufacturing benefit. But the other thing I think is the sort of digital link is So currently every building is a prototype, every building's bespoke. So even if you captured some useful data about that asset, it doesn't tell you anything other than how that asset performs. So you remember the kind of early BIM slides, it showed this digital feedback loop, operational data feeds into the start of the process. It doesn't do that where the data can't be placed somewhere, it can't be put in a repository. Whereas if you were using the same components again and again, you could start then to see which clusters of components perform better. You could start to get data out of, the first generation of schools and say, actually, the components need to flex to do this sort of thing. And it would start to drive this continuous improvement loop, which again, manufacturing does. So until we get, I think, a level of standardization, we'll never unlock all of these other benefits in terms of digital and manufacturing. But also when we talk to clients, a lot of them want standardization. So our residential developer clients say, look, I've got my pattern book of apartments, that's what I want to sell, that's the product I sell. I don't want design teams to mess with them and to change the grids and to change the spans and make them slightly bigger or smaller. I want my design teams to focus on placemaking and articulation of the facade and aspect and prospect and energy balance and all of these kind of interesting creative challenges. I don't want them to design a one-bed flat again. I know what a one-bed flat is. So we're seeing clients, certainly public sector, some private sector, where they're saying, look, I know my product. I don't want to pay for bespoke. I want, a level of standardization. I'd rather you focus your efforts somewhere else. So again, I think the sort of evidence-based data capture that drives the platform's kit apart, again, gives you a sort of really solid basis to say, here's why we've developed these typologies, because we know they work, they're very efficient, they meet the government standards, drives this kit apart. We do those at scale, and now we can all focus on the more interesting bit. And that's how manufacturing's got better over decades by lots and lots of incremental improvements. Construction never gets there because it reinvents the wheel every single time. So platforms is our attempt to sort of try and ground something we can then collectively build on and just improves over time.
Thank you for that. So Stephen, Dale's already talked about systems, and Jaimie also talking about systems. In MBS, we recognise that systems were needed in terms of product specification, but also then to move into those products and the manufacturer's products that can be bought. Can you just tell us a little bit about the process we went through and what we deliver now?
Yeah, so I guess over the decades at NBS, we've traditionally structured our specification content by common arrangement of work sections, which was very much around the sort of similar materials in a chapter of a publication, which would then get split up going to the individual trades. And what we wanted to do at NBS was sort of reimagine our content, restructure it, so it modeled how buildings were actually built and modeled those relationships. So if you imagine in common arrangement of work sections, if you're specifying a ceiling, there's no natural home for the ceiling as a system. You've got sort of plasterboard in one section, fire stops in another section, insulation in another section. But as designer, things in terms of the systems that make up that building, and they give design responsibility around those systems. So what we did when we started off on the journey to restructure around Uniclass 2015 is break down the sort of built environment in terms of objects from an entire sort of complex going all the way down to sort of buildings, elements, systems, and then products. So if you're a building service engineer, you think of a building in terms of its heating systems, its ventilation systems, its air conditioning systems, which are made up of things such as boilers, pipes, radiators. If you're an architect, you think of something like a partition as being made up of its timber frame, its insulation, and its plasterboard. So we have the Uniclass 2015 structure now in NBS Chorus, which aligns very nicely with how the building is actually digitally modeled. And that allows you to link the 3D model with the specification, which contains all of that. Sort of all of those information requirements that pass on to the next stage, whether that's quality of product, whether it's the quality of execution, or whether it's the handover requirements which feed into the next information delivery plan in terms of really important things like testing, whether samples are needed, commissioning, things like that needs to happen at the end of the job to ensure there's a soft landing for the client.
And that kind of leads us into the next kind of big topic, which is the Building Safety Bill. For those who are not in the UK, post-Grenfell, the UK industry was analysed in some detail. Dame Judith Hackett produced her Building a Safer Future report, which gave recommendations on how we should transform construction, both the regulatory environment, but the design, construction and operational focus. I noticed one of the questions we've already got coming through is all about FM, and so we'll cover that. Please keep sending them through. But the Building Safety Bill now is in a draft form. It's introducing new statutory roles for the client, for the principal designer, principal contractor, and other designers and contractors as well. And this will create a statutory role, a statutory responsibility for these roles to do the job properly, and in particular, this concept of the golden thread. So in terms of processes, how do we see the Building Safety Bill as being another of those drivers for digital change? And do we think it's going to happen quickly enough? Dale, you've already mentioned work that you've done with clients, and Jaimie, you were talking in platform about your housing developers. Those housing developers are now going to have new regulatory requirements. Have you got any experience so far that they've seen that and they know what they're going to do next?
I think it's too early to see how it might change the project team or the design team or the culture. But I mean, for me, Richard, I would just keep coming back to the challenge that I said before. Part of the problem is who is responsible for design. Is it the design team? And when the baton gets passed over to the contractor, is it the contractor? So I think a lot of the issues from Grenfell are to do with responsibility. I don't think they're necessarily kind of issues that are unusual. I mean, and they're what we're used to dealing with as architects our whole career. So I think a lot of it is to do, back to my point about procurement. But coming back to how digital might assist, I mean, I think there's two layers to that. The first one is that more object-based modeling and having clarity about who's putting those objects into the model would help. So back to this point, who is specifying? And I think if you start to look at this holistically, it's the same with a net zero perspective. The kind of environmental credentials of products becomes of equal importance. What's our carbon content? Where are they coming from? So I think kind of what we do need is a huge amount of data around the products that we specify, that plays into that, not just the Grenfell agenda, but also the environmental agenda. And certainly, I think what we haven't seen enough of around certainly the work coming out of the UK government BIM-wise is enough uptake of kind of the whole database side of things. I still think there's too much focus in the geometry, which is clearly important. I mean, we live in environments that are geometry. We don't live in assets. We live in homes and communities. So I think that's absolutely important as well. But certainly for me, our approach, just building on what Jaimie said about pattern books, we call our approach really digital libraries. And for us, having digital libraries of spaces is absolutely crucial. And I think one of the things that's really impeding innovation just now is too much of our workflow is focused on 2D. And I think a lot of the challenges of industry, whether it's environmental or Grenfell, would really be resolved if we could focus on moving to a kind of a fully 3D kind of data-driven environment, and not stop using kind of 2D as a crutch. I mean, we certainly see that in contracts. We see contracts asking for 2D deliverables that, okay, some people need them, but not everyone needs them. And we see, I think the less that we start to see focus on 2D and more on 3D data-driven environments, the more that I think some of these challenges are driven by the environment or health and safety will just kind of resolve themselves, Richard.
Yeah, and May, in terms of that legal side, getting the responsibility right is fundamental, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is completely. And I think one of the problems is people ignore that. And it's one of those, until something goes wrong, people don't really think about the contract or the documentation, because everyone everyone understands what they're supposed to do at the beginning or what discussions they've had, and then when something goes wrong, probably the people you had that initial discussion with have since moved on or possibly have forgotten what you talked about. And that's why I think with contracts, and this is not, this is applies to any issues really, it's very important to set out who is responsible for what, when, and how, because it will generally be the aspects which your contract doesn't talk about that you'll have a dispute or disagreement or concern on. If your contract's very clear, if something does go wrong, it will be obviously very apparent who should bear liability for that, or what one would hope so, and to what extent. But we are dealing with a lot of unknowns, obviously, with changes, COVID and everything else. We have to be agile in terms of our contract and our documentation and be willing to move it forward and plug the gaps.
And that whole thing around record keeping is absolutely vital. Once again, we can't say too much about Grenfell. There's an awful lot still being discovered about that whole process, but understanding who, why, when, and what was actually done is really, really fundamental. Stephen, the golden thread is this phrase which is being bandied around quite a lot just at the minute, and detailing information. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so just to pick on a few things that Dale said there about it being data driven. So you can't just say, like, here's a 3D model. You've got to think of the data that's connected to the 3D model. Responsibilities, getting that document is so important. But I think it's around creating that transparency and that audit trail around that. So if you look at the project timeline on the screen here, set around the RIBA plan of work, decisions get made through the project timeline. Like the client, I want you to use from the following supply chain agreements or what have you, the designer working out which is the right product, and these decisions are made, contractor maybe presenting a substitution that gets agreed, confirming the right thing was installed, and then finally making decisions subsequently 4 or 5 years down the line, can we replace with this product and maintain that same level of performance? So those decisions have always been made on projects, but are they getting made transparently? And are they being recorded with a clear audit trail? And I think if you can answer yes, they are, then that is your golden thread. And when you read the Building Safer Bill and you look at the gateways, the sort of digital drops, it talks about the plans and the specification. I presume plans generated from 3D model, I presume. And that means you can look back through what was specified at each stage, what went through planning, what was agreed prior to building commencing, what was agreed prior to the occupation. And you can look at those and make sure that each of those decisions was fine and approved when looking at the building regulations for, say, fire safety or structural safety. But if that's not data driven, if it's not recorded, including the changes and the responsibilities are unclear, that's where you get into trouble. So I think this is where we need to go. If people think this can just be done with a pretty 3D model, that's nothing to do with BIM. It's around, yes, build up the information in 3D, but think of everything that connects to that and how products fit together to form a system, how substitutions are managed, the required testing and inspections, they form a huge part of it.
So where do construction product manufacturers fit in all of this?
So again, so reading through the initial draft and the consultation, there was quite a few recommendations for construction manufacturers. And there was some stuff which you think maybe is a little bit sort of obvious, and other stuff which sort of goes more into the sort of digital world. But when manufacturers put their product information up, confirming it's current, right, that's the big thing. declaring the performance against the relevant standards nice and clearly. So what are the standards that define a door set or a brick or a heating system, and the whole sort of CE marking, etc. Where testing happens, clearly show valid third-party certification. Give guidance around application. So should this product be used on this type of building in this type of application? And it talked also about digital IDs that can return to the cloud, so you can check off something like a QR code or a barcode or an RFID, or even just a hyperlink inside an Excel spreadsheet or a database. So I think manufacturers need to sort of take a step back, and I think I do have a little slide here, and think, how do I represent all of this information to the wider industry? So how do I classify it correctly? How do I make sure it's current, to have a permanent hyperlink, and show my third-party certification, whether that's sort of BSI, Kite Mark, Certifier, Secure by Design, what have you, guidance on application. So this product should be used in the following systems, not used in the other systems. And then in terms of the declaration of performance, use that same terminology and align it with the relevant construction standards. So yeah, there's a huge part for manufacturers to play in terms of showing their information in a standard form and sort of giving that transparency.
Thank you for that. Jaimie, you mentioned that you work with a number of client organisations. Do you think that they are ready for this? Are they aware of it? Will it change the way they need to work?
I think, as Dale says, it's probably too soon to feel the impact yet. It's too soon to see what it'll do. I think in my head it will sort of contribute more pressure to some initiatives that were already underway. So when I talked earlier about the kind of standard pattern books, as Dale says, digital libraries, a number of our clients were doing that because it would simplify the process, it would make the design process quicker, it would then so you could take your component set or base design, you could optimize it, and that would have a sustainability benefit. It would then sort of lead into DFMA. So I think people were doing these things for a number of reasons anyway. I think the increasing importance of the digital thread only exacerbates or only reinforces why this is an important thing to do. So I think Dale's point about having digital libraries, using that as a repository for some of the things Stephen was talking about, using that standardization then to look at better forms of construction, more sustainable forms of construction, and maintain the digital thread. It's all, there's a number of initiatives. I think they're all pointing in the same direction. They're all telling you to do the same thing. And if you do it for one of them, you automatically get the benefit of it for all of them. So I think that's why it's, it doesn't feel to me like a new initiative that will change clients' behaviour. It might just speed up the behaviours that they were already sort of they had in motion.
That brings us around to that transformation and COVID driving change. Of course, it's just accelerating rather than changing.
Yeah.
I want to move on now to talk about another subject which prior to COVID was right at the forefront of all of our minds, which was the climate emergency. Construction and buildings are one of the biggest contributors to CO2, and we'd already seen through pressure from people through the climate change bodies that we need to improve our performance. We've talked about the move to net zero in operating carbon, but there's also embodied carbon and also improvements through design and delivery. All of these can contribute to a more sustainable construction industry. Where do people go? Where do they start if they want to make a difference in terms of delivering improved sustainable design? Jaimie,
so I'll have a go at that one. So where we started, or the reason we became an integrated design consultancy rather than we started out as purely architects, was we could see there was just a massive inefficiency in the lack of integration or coordination between the disciplines was causing a lot of the problems. So even in the period since I left university, we now have, we work on schemes with a facade architect, interior architect, executive architect, concept architect. The industry split itself into lots and lots of different, I would say narrow but deep specialisms. So you need thousands of them now for a project team. I think all of the gaps in between them is where all the risk sits. So we started becoming integrated because we recognised that, for instance, if you wanted to do DFMA, which was our driver, then you had to be a lot more closely integrated. So for instance, in hospitals, we see projects where you've got a structural zone, the ductwork zone, the pipework zone, the cable tray zone, the comm zone, the ceiling zone, the lighting zone. So you get all these sort of zones just so people don't have to integrate. They can leg it about on their zone and not touch anyone else. What we started doing was saying, well, if I could compress that and make the ceiling void much smaller, but much more like, you know, the underside of a car bonnet, automatically I've dropped the floor to floor heights, which means I've got less facade. It means the overall building volume is lower. It means I'm then heating and treating less air, which means my air handling units get lower, which means they have less energy in use. So there's a whole load of you know, sustainability benefits we can get our hands on before you even get to design for manufacture, just doing a much better job of getting an integrated design, a tighter design. We describe it as a chain reaction of all these other benefits, and it lends itself to DFMA, it lends itself to these other things. So yeah, I think there's a piece of work we could do, even if we built traditionally. There's a lot we could do in the design phase to make our assets a lot more compact, say, that would drive a lot of these benefits. And then you get into the DFMA. And the thing we're doing, keep harping on about platforms, but again, when you've got those standardized components, if you're going to use them again and again, you know, every gram I take out of a bracket, every manufacturing process I can remove, if I'm going to use that bracket a million times, has a massive multiplier effect. So the more you get into standardized components, the more it's worth optimizing them using less material and then less people, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it has this sort of huge impact. So the site with the project we've got on site for Landsec at the moment, its embodied carbon is 20% less than a traditional construction. It's the first platform building. It's Landsec's first net zero building. So we're already seeing, you know, we're in the foothills of this, but we're already seeing big benefits in terms of cost, but also sustainability, operational cost and things, and that's only going to start to get better. So again, we see this as a, you know, this way of working as a way of enabling all sorts of things, not just digital, but sustainability as well, and a range of other topics.
I love that. I love the fact that the integration and collaboration is one of the drivers for sustainability, not just in terms of building and cost efficiency, but it's there for carbon efficiency as well. I think that's fabulous. Dale, working with distributed teams, where do you all go? How do you bring this together? And do you place a focus on sustainable design and carbon management as part of your practice processes?
No, absolutely. We've got a huge global initiative just now to move towards net zero. So it's a huge thrust of effort in AECOM just now to try and help to contribute to this kind of whole topic. I think for me, I mean, I'm working on a project for Moorfields Eye Hospital in UCL just now. It's, you know, £200 million plus project, and we're about to go into planning next month. So it's needless to say that we've had a lot of challenges around, you know, trying to hit some of the sustainability targets, Richard. I think what I would say is, I mean, certainly reading up on the circular economy, I think is certainly time well spent. I think all the thinking that's done behind that, and certainly David Cheshire and our team has written a book on that and how to apply it to the you know, to the built environment. So I think circular economy thinking, I think, is crucial to the future, and not just how we actually build buildings, but how we disassemble them as well, which of course is all part of the D4MA kind of topics that Jaimie's been talking about. I think, you know, I kind of spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, the lead designer role and how does that play to the future of design. And the challenge, as I see it, is in the past we maybe had half a dozen topics that we had to think about when we were doing coordination. And maybe a lot of these we didn't really have to go too deep into our thinking. But what I'm seeing now, Richard, is that the breadth of topics that you need to understand to design a building is increasing. But not just that, it's the depth of knowledge that you need in these topics. It's increasing as well. So all of a sudden you've got a narrow width and narrow depth that's gone to a huge width of topics that all interrelate. And I think that's really starting to push the boundaries of knowledge of those that are used to doing that kind of lead designer role. So I think, again, that kind of alludes back to the digital approach. I mean, certainly what we'd like to see is more design automation so that in that context that we have less decisions to make. I mean, Stephen was talking about that early on. We tend to make decisions intuitively in projects. And I think one of the things that's impeding productivity just now is that we use these absolutely amazing tools. I mean, and Jaimie's talked about bills of materials, and we're looking at that as well. We're using kind of manufacturing software to design our buildings, and we were able to push out a whole new generation of construction deliverables. But at the same time, the design is taken intuitively. You know, it all comes from our head onto a piece of paper. And I think that design process has to change as well. And I think we need a more data-led design process where, and going back to the point earlier on about every building being a kind of a unique bespoke element. I'm not convinced that going to the other extreme, which is buildings as a product, is a solution. I think that has, you know, worked in the past. So for me, the whole notion of mass customization and what that means, I think is part of that solution. And I think that plays into what Jaimie's been doing as well. You know, so a whole new generation of bigger products that we can specify. I mean, if I'm doing an office building, I cannot go to a catalog and find a modular toilet to then, you know, configure the components within it. And those are the sort of things that we need. More pattern books, more elements that we can go and really specify off the shelf, rather than doing a design intent and then someone then producing fabrication drawings. So I think there's a huge amount that can be done, Richard, but I don't think we should underestimate the challenge moving forward because of the sheer volume of topics that we're addressing simultaneously.
So
yeah,
yeah,
I think
just
this is
to
where
chip in on that. Yeah, we've been I would say standardizing at component level while leaving complete flexibility at building level. Yeah. Which is a manufacturing thing. Yeah. So we use standard components, but you can configure them lots of different ways. So we actually use that digital library to generate, we use automated design to generate lots of potential solutions, and then we can do the building physics analysis, the energy balance analysis. So we actually get more design iterations quicker and get more optimized overall solutions. And then when you're ready, you go and now press the button, it generates the bill of materials and things. So we're using the standardization at a much smaller level to get an overall better design outcome, I think.
Correct. Yeah, and I think generative and other kind of ways of doing design automation are absolutely crucial if we're going to effectively move into the future.
Yeah, I think this is where I would do the plug for MBS, of course. We are connecting construction information and we provide lots of guidance with links off to multiple sources. So it's all very context based because, as you say, few people can hold all of that in one place, in one mind. So actually connecting and integrating, collaborating amongst the teams, I think it becomes more and more fundamental as we become more digital. I just want to finish off just quickly now because we're running out of time on BIM leadership, and also we've got a number of questions that I would like to just follow up. So I just want to come back to where the UK was in terms of being at the vanguard of digital construction, and also credit the work that's been done by UK BIM Alliance, the work now within the construction industry hub as well. We've got lots of reports and guidance and support on how to deliver BIM effectively. If I was starting, May, I'm going to point this one to you. If I was starting now my digital journey, for those who haven't really got to this, where should I start?
About BIM specifically, or just digital generally?
Just in this digital move, and where are the sources of guidance to help me make the progress along that digital journey?
I think from a BIM perspective, it's worth going to the UK BIM framework website and looking at the guidance, start at the basics before you move on. And obviously BIM is currently the big one. And I would say from using my own experience, obviously when I first started the BIM digital journey, there wasn't anything that I could find on the legal contractual documentation side, although it's different now. And I just went to events, go attend webinars and ask the stupid questions, because there's no such thing as a stupid question. No one probably knows the answer either. And go to the basic ones. Go to the BIM Plus website, which has a lot of industry writing about everything from quite the basic things to the very complicated ones. But I think that there's no, apart from BIM is because it's slightly more mature, there's one place, but for everything else, there isn't really. I would say blockchain, the CBC website, Construction Blockchain Consortium has everything. They do a lot of really great events. They have a conference coming up next month on the blockchain side of construction. But digital as a whole, unfortunately, there's no one place where you can say, give me everything I need to know. It's a bit piecemeal, and part of that is because the digital solution for each project will depend on who the players are, what the project needs. I often get asked, is there a standard documentation, standard set of specifications we can just add on to every single project? And it's like, well, the answer, not really, because what does the client actually want from this? What's their maturity? What's the maturity of the team? Do they know how to use the software? Do they need training? All the devil's in the detail. And I think it's also accepting it's always a learning process. Get the basics and then just be willing to understand you probably won't know everything ever.
I think there's so much more we could talk about in terms of all of that advice. The interoperability report that was published by the Construction Innovation Hub, looking at Uniclass, there's an awful lot around how we organize data, and that's particularly important for clients with portfolios and managing data, asset management, etc. Stephen, in terms of data, sustainable data, Uniclass, is MBS the place where you can find some of that as well?
Yeah, maybe just say a little bit about Uniclass. Back in 2014 or so, we were commissioned by UK government to develop the classification system for BIM, and that's been, it was published in 2015, and it's been slowly improving and being revised with new classifications for the last sort of five years. I think there's been sort of 19 different updates to the systems and product tables, especially over that time. And in terms of sort of industry involvement, like on the content side, we've had some really fantastic engagement. Some of the largest client groups, government departments. I was only last week I saw some of the training guides that Environment Agency have now got, like also for the wider infrastructure as well, not just buildings, and they're sharing those with Highways England and Transport for London. So yeah, getting Thames Tideway getting used around the UK and sort of all the big client groups. There's the API for Uniclass, which got some big name sort of dedicated software development companies, the likes of Viewpoint, but also some of the big sort of engineering companies that have in-house software development capabilities. And we started off seeing UK being developed for UK and Ireland, but like increasingly now in Australia, state of Victoria, New South Wales, where it's being mandated for infrastructure work, and really starting to take traction now around the world. Japan, Southeast Asia, Middle East. I was only hearing yesterday, talking to one of our really big customers, working on a project, real project from Dubai to Oman. I don't know, 15, 20 buildings in the entire rail network, and the client there's mandated Uniclass 2015 across the entire project. And it just goes to show that with that initial government seeding into the private sector, making things Creative Commons, open data, having a sort of standard way of doing things, it can have a huge influence around the world, with the UK being the lead.
Thank you for that. I'm now going to, just before we finish, just a couple of the questions that have come through that I think we ought to cover. Just talking about the tools that organisations have found to be beneficial, and examples of the tech that people are investing in. What May, what tools are you using across the organisation that have really helped the efficiency and delivery for BuroHappold?
I think one of the things is using cloud platform in a heavier way. Whilst we always used cloud platforms, so no names of which ones, but it's using it as standard across the organization and making sure people understand how to integrate it, where to put their documentation, their models, and on different projects, as well as using when you have video chats, using all the tools where you can use now digital whiteboards and things like that, where you want to design together, but rather you aren't all in the room, and rather than just talk about it, which is quite limiting, there are other add-ons to the various video chats that you can use to integrate for the design process. And I think those two things have made a real change, because BuroHappold uses BIM technology on every project, and to varying degrees depending on what the client wants. But it's because you aren't able to walk over to someone and show them something, you have to make sure you are uploading it in the right way in your internal systems.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Dale, you'd already mentioned one of the tools that you'd found to help in terms of that digital whiteboard. What else have you found that has been really beneficial to the organisation?
I don't think there's one specific tool. I mean, really what we're trying to do is look at different ways to connect all the different tools. Let's say we're using manufacturing software. I mean, we're looking at bills and materials, we're looking at PLMs, we're looking at a whole wide range of things that we think might help the design process. So there's I don't think there's one tool. I think for us, it's all about workflow. And the main thing for us is really the digital library approach that we've delivered for a number of clients, because I think that's where you start to be kind of paradigm shifting when you start to look at the design automation that can layer into that, Richard. So for me, the focus is not on a specific tool. It's really around how we can automate between all the different pieces of the workflow.
Thank you for that. And Jaimie, you were probably already tooled up to the hilt, given you're already that digital organisation.
Yeah, it is. I suppose to not answer that question actually, but a thing that's been maybe slightly troubling me. So May made a point earlier about the younger generation who are very much online and know exactly how to do all this stuff. Counterintuitively, actually, I think they're the generation that are suffering through this. So a lot of our younger staff are the people that are doing, Zoom calls on a kitchen table with 4 other people, and they're fed up with it. But also a lot of the training that happens in the office is because you hear conversations happening, you kind of chance upon meetings, you run into people. So yeah, I worry that the younger generation actually, who don't have the kind of experience and the professional networks and the social networks and things in quite the same way that maybe some of the senior people do, whilst they're the best at using the tools, they're the ones who most need the human element, the office element. So we've been thinking a lot about what's the office for moving forwards. And actually, I still think there's a sort of vital training and marinating people in company culture. So again, it's a bit like BIM. It's not really, the tools are already there. That's completely fine. I think working out how we use them, not going too far into a kind of online world, but making sure we keep enough of that human interaction is going to be vital moving forwards. And you hear people going, why do we have an office? We never need an office. And you go, no, we do. There's some really sort of fundamental things that happen between people that we mustn't lose, and we mustn't think it's only about the tech and the technology.
That is such an important area. I think we could have a whole day talking about back to office, social interaction, training, skills development, barriers to change. But I think in a week when MBS has just opened its office, but done in a number of cohorts, specifically to get people back and to have that interaction, I think that is really, really important. I'm just going to do one last question for the whole panel, which is a really interesting one because it is another one of those barriers. And that's, why do you think the industry is so focused on 2D? Is there a reluctance to move to 3D because of a perceived lack of need or knowledge to do so? I'm going to put that back to you, Jaimie, because everything you do is in 3D, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure lots of people have heard me talk about this before, but I often use the example of my 2 sons who play Minecraft. So they already work in a global co-creating 3D environment. They use standard components, like they already know how to do this. So if there's people who are resistant to 3D. I suspect it's a sort of generational thing. Maybe it's to do with how you were trained and how you were brought up, because my gut feel is that anyone of a certain age and below instinctively works in 3D. So I think if it's a problem still, then it's a problem that will evaporate over a number of years as we start to get more and more people who just intuitively know how to work in this environment.
Engineering has to be in 3D, doesn't it?
Exactly, and BuroHappold do everything in 3D. However, I think I agree with Jaimie. It's very much what you're used to, and it's like a lot of people still want paper copies of contracts with wet signature, despite the fact that everyone's working from home. And this is what we feel comfortable with. And as time goes on, people will get more used to working in 3D, more used to everything being electronic. And I think as the generations move forward, the people who have always worked in 3D, so it is standard. But considering people have been using, say, BIM and digital generally has been a requirement by clients for some years now, I think it is shifting in that direction. If you went back 5 years, generally deliverables were only 2D, and and probably you had some models, you'd be working to the models as well. Whereas now you do see models as the deliverables, and 2Ds are meant to come from the models rather than the other way around. So we are seeing progress.
And I think as a multidisciplinary organisation, Dale, coordination across that 3D must be vital to success for you.
Yeah, and I mean, Jaimie picked up on this before. I mean, I think integrated design is definitely the future. I just can't see some of the innovation that we're doing being achievable by just putting together a design team for a single project. I think there's just too much innovation happening. I suppose that part of the challenge is, I mean, I was part of the kind of cohort that, if you like, went from the drawing board to CAD, and if you like, that we ended up with the same deliverable, and people were trying to kind of get CAD to look like the drawing board deliverables, and that was one technology, just one. If you think now we've got dozens and dozens of technology, we've got drones, we've got robotics, there's a huge number of topics, and I don't think that we're ready yet as an industry for that era of constant change. I mean, I think there's some people, and it goes back to the people that talk about level 2 or level 3. I think some people think that there's going to be a new steady state in the future. There is never going to be a steady state ever. We are in a world of constant change, using new technology all the time, and that's what we have to get used to. And I think there's a whole new layer of topics that tumble out of that. So, for example, is there such a thing as perfection in the future, with your workflow? Because if you're working towards a tool that's coming out in 6 months' time, why would you want to perfect your workflow today? So I think there's a whole new raft of topics that we need to start thinking about, lifelong learning, and and I think there is a generational thing in there, and I think part of the thing for me, it's not about 2D and 3D, because it's obviously more complex than that, because you've also got about data and scripting, and the need for a whole new generation of professionals to come into the construction industry, data scientists, and even anthropologists, biologists. I mean, we need new people to come in. So I think there is a very big challenge. I mean, even things, Richard, like with climate change, we need to involve scientists more, and engineering is not the same as science. So there's a whole raft of topics that we need to embrace, and that just adds to the complexity of the challenge into the future.
And I think that's a really great point to finish, actually, that for me, the real test will be the move from documents to data. We don't need to have the physical. It can be the data that is actually driving all of this and making decisions based on data, not based on intuition. I think for all of the people watching and listening, you'll be able to find out more about this. You'll be able to view this again online. Go to the MBS website. You'll be able to find webinars that have already been done and future webinars. And in particular, on the 13th and 14th of October, we have our Construction Leaders Summit. So please do register. We've already confirmed Dame Judith Hackett. She'll be able to tell you all about the new regulatory environment that is coming to the construction industry post Grenfell. You'll be able to hear more about industry leaders talking in their areas, particularly around technology, around the social side, and a focus for the design and construction teams on the second day, as well as a focus for manufacturers. So please do go and find out more and register for that event. I'll draw this one to a close by saying thank you to our panel members. I think that has been a fantastic debate, really interesting areas that come out of it. And I think certainly for me, some areas where I think we probably need to have more of a debate and share that with our customers online. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks all. Thanks for listening.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard, and to all of our speakers and everyone who's joined us in the audience as well. As Richard mentioned, you will all receive an on-demand copy of today's session via email within the next 24 hours, so keep an eye out for that. And don't forget to check the Festival of BIM and Digital Construction website to see and register for all our upcoming sessions, with our next webinar taking place October the 6th. We hope you enjoyed today's session and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you all and stay safe.
Cheers, everyone.
All right. See you soon, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Dale. Take care.
Cheers.
Cheerio. Oh, cheerio. Luckily my voice held out.